My husband's mother is a control freak who made our lives a living hell, so I gave my husband an ultimatum. She went absolutely insane and got arrested for assaulting me when she found out. My husband is the ultimate mama's boy, and even 3 years into our marriage, he gossips to her about every one of our problems. If we have a disagreement about the dirty dishes, he calls her to complain about me. If we disagree on what movie to watch, he calls her so she can convince me to go with his suggestion. However, this isn't the worst of it. He asks his mom for permission to do things. If we have a date night planned, he calls her to ask her if he can go out. Last week, she told him that it was too late to go to a restaurant with me at 9. He listened to her and canceled the reservation. She calls him at 10:30 on the dot every night to tell him that it's bedtime, and he religiously listens to her, even if going to bed interrupts what we're doing. I used to confront him about this, but instead of responding to me, he would call his mom and ask her to explain to me why their relationship is the way it is. The one time I convinced him to try put his foot down, he called his mom, but then came back into me 20 minutes later and started berating me for trying to manipulate and control him. I feel as if specific examples are needed to really understand how insane his mother is. When John and I were dating, we were planning a weekend getaway. We needed something romantic just for the two of us. I was excited. I imagined a cozy cabin in the mountains where we could enjoy some much-needed alone time. But before we even finalized the details, John said he needed to check with his mom first. I laughed it off at the time. I figured he was just being considerate. Maybe she was protective because he's her only child, I thought. But then, he actually called her to ask if we could stay at the cabin. She told no. Apparently it was way too dangerous, and her precious boy isn't used to being so far away from her. He took her word on it and told me we couldn't go. I asked him if he wanted to himself, and he shrugged. He said it didn't matter whether or not he wanted to. His mother said no, and that's all there was to it. We ended up staying in my house for the getaway, as it was the only place his mother deemed safe. That was a huge red flag, and I wish I had not ignored it. Whilst we were dating, there were countless times during our dates when his mother would call him, sometimes more than once, to check in or remind him of something trivial, like taking his vitamins or avoiding certain foods. I brushed it off as quirky, thinking that once we were married, he'd set boundaries and she'd back off. But here we are, years into our marriage, and nothing has changed. Linda is just as overprotective as she was when we first started dating, if not more. Things came to a head on our anniversary. It was our 3rd wedding anniversary, and I'd planned a romantic evening for us. Dinner at the place where we had our first date, followed by a night at a cozy little B&B just out of town. I was so excited to surprise him, but when I got home, John wasn't there. I called him and quickly realized he had forgotten our anniversary. He was out having dinner with his mom because she had a rough day and needed company. When John finally came home, I was furious. The day of our anniversary was supposed to be special. I tried to explain how much this day meant to me. I didn't want to spend our anniversary in a shouting match, but that's where we ended up. I was fed up not just with the anniversary, but everything. The anniversary, his mother's interfering, and his inability to see how it was tearing us apart. I could see him growing defensive. It felt like the same pattern repeating itself, where he'd find a way to justify her actions and leave me feeling unheard and undervalued. And after our massive fight, instead of apologizing or even trying to make things right, he did what he always does. He called his mom. I could hear him in the next room, telling her all about how unreasonable I was being, how I didn't understand their relationship, and how I was blowing things out of proportion. That was it, I snapped. I walked into the room, grabbed the phone out of his hand, and told Linda she needed to stop messing in our marriage, and if she wanted to boss someone around, she should find her own man. His mother, Linda, of course, was ticked off. She said I was just jealous of their close relationship and that I was trying to come between them. We had a huge argument right there on the phone, with John standing between us, looking like a deer caught in headlights. Linda wasn't just angry, she was vindictive. The next day, she showed up at our house unannounced. She didn't even bother knocking. She just walked in like she owned the place. She acted like nothing had happened and was there to visit us. Then at dinner, she started criticizing the way I cooked. I had spent the entire afternoon making one of John's favorite dishes, spicy chicken curry. I knew he loved it with an extra kick, and I was excited to serve it to him. As we all sat at the table, I watched Linda take her first bite. Her face immediately tightened. She put her fork down, dabbing at her mouth with a napkin as if the food had offended her. I asked her if everything was okay, and she said the food was too spicy and that I should tone down the heat. She then turned to John and told him she didn't know how he could eat anything like this, and that such spicy food wasn't good for his stomach. John shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly torn. He then offered to have us get takeout to make everyone happy, but I didn't want takeout. I had spent hours cooking and was ready to eat then. Linda said that she needed anything else to eat, saying again that my cooking was too spicy. She said she needed food fast because she didn't want to starve. She made it it clear that she wasn't eating my curry. The following week, she told John to meet her at a coffee shop to spend time together after John and I had already made plans. John told her that he could meet her after his date with me, but she was persistent. She told him to bring me along and that it had been too long since they'd spent mother-son time together. When we arrived at the coffee shop, Linda was already seated. She greeted John warmly and barely acknowledged me as I slid into the seat next to him. I could feel her eyes scanning me from head to toe. I wore a simple sundress and some sandals. As soon as we ordered, Linda leaned back in her chair and said to me, "Well, isn't that an interesting choice? Not many people would dare to wear something like that nowadays, but you don't care about standing out, do you?" I forced a smile, trying to brush off her curve, the restraining order. She lost it. She got violent and actually pushed me and grabbed my hair. The police were called, and Linda was arrested for assault. John was in shock. He couldn't believe how far his mom had gone, and for the first time, he saw how toxic her behavior really was. He went to visit her in jail, hoping to talk some sense into her, but she refused to apologize. She told him that he was making a huge mistake and that he would regret choosing me over her. John was heartbroken. He knew he had to make a choice, but it was tearing him apart. After a long conversation, John finally decided that he needed to cut ties with his mom for the sake of our marriage and his own happiness. It wasn't an easy decision, and I could see how much it hurt him, but he knew it was the right thing to do. But the cashier, who had overheard, chuckled awkwardly as she handed us our drinks. Linda wasn't done, though. She looked over at a group of women sitting by the window, all dressed in stylish outfits that seemed to catch her attention. "Now look at that," she said, gesturing at them. "That's what you call chic. It's nice to see some people still know how to dress for the occasion. Don't you think, dear?" she added, looking at the cashier for agreement. The cashier was clearly uncomfortable and just nodded before quickly retreating behind the counter. I felt my face burning red with embarrassment. John shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. He glanced at me with an apologetic look. I was left feeling humiliated. As time went on, it felt like she was trying to push me out of my own relationship and take over as the woman of the house. I tried to stand up for myself, but John would take his mom's side every time I did. He'd say things like, "She's just trying to help," or, "You know she means well." As the weeks went by, Linda's intrusions into our lives only grew more intense. It was no longer just about her controlling John. She had started to extend her reach into every aspect of my life too. It started subtly at first. During one of her frequent visits, she casually mentioned that John should be eating more vegetables, suggesting that I should prepare healthier meals for him. "You know, John used to love my spinach casserole," she said with a smile. She often implied my cooking wasn't up to par. The message was clear. I wasn't feeding him properly, and it was my responsibility to fix that. But it didn't stop there. One evening, as I was getting ready for a date night with John, Linda unexpectedly dropped by. She took one look at my outfit and pursed her lips. She asked me if that was what I was wearing on a date with John, though it wasn't really a question. She then went on to suggest that something more appropriate would better suit the evening, like a more conservative dress or something else classy, rather than the outfit I had chosen. I was left standing in front of the mirror, suddenly second-guessing my choice, even though it was something I had felt confident in every other time I wore it. The final straw came one night when Linda stayed over after dinner. We were saying our goodnights when she casually mentioned that John always performed best at work when he got at least 8 hours of sleep. She said we both should be in bed by 10. Her tone made it sound less like advice and more like a command. I could hardly believe it. She was dictating my bedtime as if I were a child who needed to be told when to go to sleep. I began to dread her visits. I knew they would come with another round of criticisms and suggestions. It was like living with a dictator. The worst part was that John didn't see anything wrong with it. He thought his mom was just being caring and concerned, but I knew better. She tried to control every aspect of our lives, and I was fed up. Finally, I told John he needed to choose me or his mom. I didn't want to do it, but I couldn't live like this anymore. I told him that I married him, not his mom, and that I wasn't going to continue in a marriage where she controlled everything. John was devastated. He tried to convince me that we could all get along and that I just needed to be more understanding, but I stood firm. I told him that if he didn't set boundaries with his mom, I was done. John agreed to talk to his mom, but when he did, all hell broke loose. Linda was furious. She told him that he should never choose his wife over his own mother, and she even threatened to cut him off if he didn't do what she said. John was torn. He loved his mom but didn't want to lose me either. He was stuck in the middle, and it was tearing him apart. Linda started spreading lies about me to our friends and family, saying that I was trying to break up the family and that I was driving a wedge between her and John. One evening while I was cleaning up the kitchen, my phone buzzed. It was John's cousin Sarah. She mentioned she'd heard some things from Linda and wanted to check if they were true. My heart sank as she told me everything Linda had claimed was true. She said I wasn't taking care of John properly, cooking the way I should, dressing inappropriately, and keeping him up late, which affected his work. I explained the situation and how Linda had been overstepping and imposing her expectations on me. I could sense Sarah's discomfort, but she seemed to understand by the end of the call. She even called my work making false complaints about me. I got called called into my boss's office and was told that there had been some concerning reports about my behavior. I was blindsided. I'd always maintained a strong work ethic and had never received any negative feedback before. As my manager continued, it became clear that the complaint had been detailed and specific, citing supposed issues with how I interacted with colleagues and handled my responsibilities. The kicker came when they mentioned that the complaint had originated from a phone call. It was someone claiming to be a concerned family member who wanted to ensure I was performing at my best. It didn't take long for me to piece it together. As a result of the complaint, I was required to take a mandatory workplace conduct training course. It felt like a slap in the face, being forced to sit through a class on skills I knew I already had, all because Linda had decided to poison the well at my job. She almost cost me my job, and I was terrified. That's when I decided to get a restraining order against Linda. I knew it would be a drastic step, but I didn't know what else to do. When I tried to see